The hard part is for a client to say, I love this space because it's light, bright, and airy. I think the way to teach then is to then point out the design moves that a design professional made to say, well, this is why you feel that way, because that transom window over there lets light come in throughout the day. And you are also looking at a large window that you're connected with your garden, which brings you joy on a continual basis. Those things together creates a space that, and creates calm and serenity and peace, or whatever the emotion you just talked about.
Welcome to Architecture, Design, and Photography. Today we are speaking with Rick Staub. Am I saying that right?
Nope, it's Staub. S-T-A-U-B.
There's no R. Look at that. Rick Staub, co-creator of Your Modern Cottage. And am I saying that right as far as co-creator?
That one you have right, yep.
Good. So
co-creators are right, yep.
Tell me about your other creators, yourself and Your Modern Cottage, your background, all of that.
All right. So my background, I'm an architect. I've been doing this for more than 25 years now, close to 30 if you consider my high school career doing some designs for my dad when I was a kid. So we are a firm, and I have another firm called Point One Architects down in Old Lyme, Connecticut. We do both commercial and residential work. And for the past 20 years or so, I've been kind of focusing on the residential side of that, and I've grown quite fond of doing that and working with clients and solving their problems. A couple of years ago, we started to think about some of the challenges we were facing with our clients and marketing, and trying to understand how clients interact with architects, especially in the residential world, and came to find out that most of them are pretty naive to the process. And so with that in mind, I started thinking of this kind of outlet to educate our potential clients about what architects do. And that kind of led to this concept of Your Modern Cottage. And so probably about 20 years ago, I met a PR woman, Jennifer Carmichael, who's my co-creator at Your Modern Cottage. And she is kind of a marketing PR writer. And we decided over the years, working through PR for the firm of Point One Architects, to basically that evolved into this idea of creating a blog post to start sharing content with the world about what architects provide for clients, the value we bring, because that was the biggest challenge I felt, that most people in the world don't understand the value that architects deliver to home design. And that's kind of the beginning of what Your Modern Cottage was.
So essentially a inspirational and educational outlet to speak to essentially potential clients.
Yeah, exactly that. It's inspiration kind of to start, but then this idea of giving the knowledge behind why people are inspired by certain things they look at. There's designers work really hard to design things. And I think a lot of people just look at those designs and think that it happens without a whole lot of back thought or back education or knowledge into what's happening there. But what it is it's a deep insight into the clients to end up with the designs that make sense.
So I'd like to go deep on that creative process. And it seems like you're hitting on that, on the real value of that whole process of creativity as it applies to solving a design problem for a residential client, mostly. In this
Correct.
case, would you see yourself as a creative?
Sure, most definitely.
Would you see yourself as an artist?
Yes.
And do you see a difference between those two at all?
I think creative is more a problem solving that's directed towards client solutions, where an artistic approach is more about exploring one's own kind of personal challenges within, and expressing that through whatever media they use. So architecture to me it's really directed at a client and a site, and solving the problems that really identify and work with that client on that particular site.
So a far more creative prospect with less of an artistic voice than a creative problem-solving voice.
Yeah, but there always has to be the artistic side that influences what you do.
Sure.
That's just part of who we are as humans. We have that side to us, and it always influences it. In some architects, that artistic side dominates the design. It kind of not overwhelms it, but maybe takes away from what the client's real solution can be. I think there's a fine balance between that.
Right, right. A starchitect, if you will, has far more of their own voice in the end result than a creative solution to the desired needs to be solved of the client.
Yes, but not to say that a star architect doesn't have creative design solutions as well. They just
Right.
they just
There's more
have
of
it
their
with their own
consistent
vision in mind.
voice. Yeah. Because you can always tell
Correct.
a Gary, a Stephen Hall, a Renzo Piano, it's their voice coming through very clearly.
It's their language of art. Yep.
Yeah. What if you had to more deeply describe the process of creativity? Like, what does that feel like to you when you employ a creative mind, a creative approach? What exactly is that, and how does it feel to you as you work creatively?
It's been an exploration for me and actually the Point One Architects firm that I work with as well. That we've the name actually Point One Architects was developed around this idea of understanding the clients first. The first step of any architectural project is understanding the desires, needs of the client, of the user, of the space that you're designing. And from that, we've developed this concept that we call design DNA, which is a process of discovery early on. And it can take on many levels of kind of layers of information, but it works in both commercial and residential for us. And it's really a discovery project process through workshopping, through discussion, through site analysis, through challenges of zoning and context and things like that all come together to create this kind of design narrative or challenge narrative that we call it. We create a challenge statement after every initial discovery to understand really what the challenges we're trying to solve. And so for me, the design process is built around this idea of understanding the problem as best I can. We have a lot of residential clients come to us and say, I really know what I want to do here. And I always take that comment as a bit of a challenge. And really, it's like, no, you probably don't really know what you want to do here. You know what you think you need to do here, but let's get to the root of the cause that's causing you to get to that point. And if we can get to the root cause of the challenges, then we can solve the real problem instead of putting lipstick on something that may be broken. We really, if we solve the core issues, then we're solving for the longer period of time.
Right. So you have a client that comes to you with essentially abstract data points that are a problem that you then have to insert your own experience into subjectively. You have to process them and then objectify them into some solution that, as you're saying, they're kind of telling you, here's what we want to do. Here's our abstract problem and here's our end result. And you're saying, well, sometimes you have to come back and say your abstract problem might not result in what you think what you've already preconceived it's going to end up as. Myself, as an architect, creative problem solver, I'm going to subjectively go through your abstract problem as a process of experiencing, analyzing it, and then objectifying it into some fairly more concrete and utilitarian solution at the end.
It's exactly right, but there's also this component of that the client's narrative, the client problem they bring to us is only one small portion of the overall analysis we need to do. There's analysis that comes from the hard stuff that's just part of what the towns are going to allow on a site,
Right.
what the weather is doing in our location, what the context looks like. So there's many other layers on top of just that owner's analysis. It's all those things have to come together.
Right. So the owner brings their problem. and analysis of their living difficulties, but then you have to also be aware of and bring to the table further limitations upon a possible solution, that then extreme creativity has to be able to mix all of those in a blender in a cohesive way to produce an end result that's something that people accept as good.
Exactly. And what we've discovered over the years is that it's much easier to design a solution for a client when there are more, I'll call them constraints, but they're not necessarily constraints, that there's more parameters to the problem,
Right.
than an open field of nothingness. If you're trying to design in a vacuum, you really have nothing to bounce your thoughts and ideas against.
Right. If they're the more data points of limitation that are present in an abstract problem, the more precise and limited the end result would then be, because there's less possibility the more data
With a splash of art on.
Right. With a splash of
Correct. Within a splash of art on top of it.
Right.
I call it the design sauce. We all come with our special design sauce that we add to the mix at some point, but you have to get the core ingredients in there, and then you add your design sauce to it.
Right. Yeah, I've been in preparation for this, and just in my own interest in philosophically what this process is about, as you've designed and made an outlet to further illuminate this process through your modern cottage. I see a creative as someone who possesses the, for one, psychological trait of openness, to subject oneself to the abstract chaos of problems, data points, and express the resulting emotions from that subjective experience of interacting with those points of data that are the abstract, and turn that experience of interacting with that into a further objectified thing of some further degree of concrete utility. Does that make any sense?
That's it in a nutshell.
Yeah. That I've
a big nutshell, but a nutshell.
Yeah, I've constantly struggled with what creativity is. It's highly present in individuals that are high in the psychological trait of openness, as in they find more joy, meaning, and purpose in subjecting themselves to experience, and then from the emotions of that experience, creating some further objectified thing that they can hand back to the judges, if you will, to say, yes, this is good, or no, keep working.
I like your analysis of the openness, because I think that I've never thought of it that way before, but that definitely is what it needs to be. If you're not open to learning more about every time you look at something, then all you're doing is narrowly focusing your direction down one path that you're consistently used to.
Right, and a consistent,
that's not creativity necessarily. That's just working a task. Yeah,
and a consistent path that you're used to will be safe. It'll be beneficial. It'll be reliable, dependable, but it will not be something new to solve a problem that is not yet solved. So if a reliable method does completely solve the problem, do we need to find any more creative solutions? I had an architecture professor that was an extreme classicist, if that's the right word. I forget. Architecture school's a long time ago, but he was very, very
right.
connected to, there's a classical approach and it solves everything. Why do we need to do anything else? And I did not understand it at the time, but I imagine his personality was probably one that had a high degree of conscientiousness in his personality. So his approach of creativity was less one of openness, and probably far more of one of preaching the gospel of something that already works as a solution process.
understand completely, sometimes it's really hard to break out of that comfort zone of familiarity, right? That's
Yeah.
one of the challenges we always have to press ourselves against, and that's where these outside constraints actually help us a little bit. When you run into a challenge that starts to spark and break out of the normal path, and that's really a good thing for design, in my case.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's probably intrinsic in the way that potential clients choose potential architects, is that they probably resonate with some degree of this person is finding new solutions outside of existing problem solving dynamics. So a more modernist, creative, whatever new is going to connect more maybe with a potential client that desires something like that in their life rather than someone who seeks consistency and safety, comfort within a repeatable, tried and true method.
Yeah, we hope that people come with that attitude, but it's not always the case. Sometimes it's just the fact that they ran into some stick in the process, and they need something to help them get beyond that stick, and they don't quite understand what that is yet. So,
Right, right. Let's see. I got so many rambling notes of abstract thinking here. That's let me see. So my next question is, and I think you've kind of already answered. What is art, or basically the idea of a creative, someone who possesses the openness to subject themselves to the abstract chaos and express the resulting emotions of the experience into an objectified thing of some further degree of concrete utility. But then that begs the question, what is art? And I think you kind of answered that, in that art is more of a personal voice coming through creativity, that there's a personal vision that is projected through that subjective creativity. I'd call that more art, in my opinion.
yeah, and I think it also has a story that's involved with it too. It's usually trying to get some kind of messaging or story out to the world through whatever that channel might be.
Right.
Whereas I think the creative process of architecture, at least, is there is a story, but that story is relative to a client and their site and the future or the story they want to tell with themselves. So it's not a universal story. It's a more focused story.
So I think you work in the same way with a client that I work with an architect as far as architectural photography, that you're overlaying your creativity over someone else's story and their own creativity of life. You come and overlay your creative problem solving abilities over their problem, and you create a work of architecture. And then I come in lastly with my creative approach and overlay my creativity over the problem solving creativity that you already made. So there's kind of these different layers.
And I think that's actually going to become clear to you. The same, what you're saying is going to become clear to you when we talk about what your modern cottage is. The first word of that is your modern cottage. Your is about your story, the homeowner's story. It has to be based on that, at least I think. It doesn't have to be based on that, but the way I like to design and the way I like to create is that it has to be based on their story, because otherwise I'm not solving their problem if I'm doing my own story.
Right. What's your most successful, fulfilling method of listening, hearing, and embracing the story of a client?
We do this in a workshop process where we're sitting down and interviewing and playing games and giving tasks and having them kind of discuss with us the feelings and the emotions. It's really easy to get someone to talk about a 3-bedroom house with 2 bathrooms and whatever family space they want, but it's really difficult to get someone to talk about the feeling they have when they come home or the feeling they want someone to feel when they walk to their front door. And those are the things that are the most fulfilling. If we can get some good emotional content, some good feeling content out of those discussions, we're on the right path.
So to drag you deeper into the deep end. What's your take on on what emotions are compared to articulated reason and rationality, and why would emotions be more valuable than their words?
To me, emotions are built from, how do I put this? All the stuff that's been building up inside of a space over years, it becomes an emotional reaction at some point. I have an emotional reaction we get quite a bit is, for example, I hate my kitchen, right? This idea of hate kitchen is a very strong emotion. And once we get this idea of hating it, why we can then get to the points of where it sticks for them and where it doesn't work for them, and how we then can solve the problem of where it doesn't work to that. But if they come in and say, you know what, I don't like my kitchen, I really need to kind of just, I want to update it a bit. It's like, that's not giving me this kind of emotional reaction. Once I have that emotional reaction, we can then start to dig deep into it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think so. I've come to think of emotions as a native tongue, if you will, within the conversation of an individual with themselves. And it's the first and clearest voice that you understand, but the ability to articulate those emotions into word, there's a gap that has to be traversed. And so if you can go back across that gap and talk about the emotions that they feel towards their space and the complexity of that into the dissatisfaction that they hold with that space, you're going to be getting more at the foundational issue, like you're saying. That makes sense.
Yeah, you mentioned the first, and I think you said first and foremost thought they have, or first and foremost something that they have. And I think that's exactly what an emotion is. An emotion is something that has been kind of formulating within them for whatever time period they've had this issue, and that emotion becomes apparent at that point, and that's their kind of key driver, I guess.
Right. Yeah. I think of emotions as our native tongue, the first language we really understand. Now, is the process of design subjective or objective to you?
Explain that a little further. What's your...
So I have a preconceived idea on this that I don't want to say it too much, because then it clouds your response. And to get your response without me explaining my position gives me a clear idea of if I'm getting closer to actually being right about something, because I don't know if I'm right on it or not.
Okay.
But
that's fair.
Yeah, the process of designing it, to me, seems to be both it's a subjective process that you have to be open to. There's that openness again. A subjective process, so you're open to coming into this abstract and objectifying it. So design, to me, seems to be one and the same, both subjective and objective.
Yeah, so that's why I guess I asked you the question back, because the first thing that came to my mind was it has to be both. It can't be one or the other. Otherwise, you're putting it into a path that may not be the creative solution that you're looking for. I have to add my subjective opinions onto it, which is based on my history of my education and my knowledge and stuff like that. And then I have to objectify it by getting it into a tangible thing that a client can understand, and really kind of relate to.
And to me, that's got to be, in some way, shape, or form, the rationale behind calling architecture the what do they call it, the highest level of art, or there's some, I'm getting the quote completely wrong, but maybe it's that the process is both one of doing these very opposite things within a single problem to create a solution, rather than just looking for personal truth. I'm going in deep over my head there. That's going to take more refinement for me to make any sense of.
Well, you gotta explore it out loud sometimes.
Yeah. If you're not free to put bad ideas out there, you'll never be able to get them corrected and get closer to a truth, I guess.
Yep.
I feel that the creative process is one of objectification, and it seems like we agree on that. It's further developing something into a more concrete thing of utility, which is interesting to me because, our relationship to the word objectification in the U.S., I mean, I think immediately goes to the objectification of women, and we understand it.
Yeah,
I
it's a
do. It's just to say you might be this highly abstract thing with limitless potential, but I'm going to objectify you into only being of this. And that's a very negative thing when you apply it to something that has will, like a human. But in the
you tend
process
to
of
you tend to compartmentalize if you in that connotation, right?
right,
You tend to put things in a specific box, and that's not necessarily what it should be.
right. So in some cases, objectification is a further focusing and refinement and clarifying of something. In one case, it would be good. And then in another case, it's a limiting factor, which would be negative. And the determination of positive or negative, good or bad, it seems to be if will or free will or life exists in it. Crickets.
Understood. No.
How do you teach someone to understand their emotions that are connected to a space? How do you teach someone to understand?
It's through. How do we teach?
Now, I had pulled
I think
that
it's less
question
teaching than it is
because
more.
I had pulled that question because I had read that on the, I think, the bio of Your Modern Cottage, that you're striving to teach someone how they can understand, why do I love that space?
Exactly. So it's a good question. How do we get to that point of, because it's unique. Someone's love for something is unique for them, and it's very specific for them. And so it's more of understanding, to me, the idea of what design moves does an architect make to reinforce those things that people enjoy or turn into happiness in their lives. So, for instance, if someone really loves a space because it's light and bright and airy, then here are the design moves that a designer can do to help make that happen. The hard part is for a client to say to me that I love this space because it's light, bright, and airy. They just usually come and say, you know what, I love this space because it makes me feel calm, or it makes me feel relaxed, or it makes me connect to my environment, or something like that. And so I think the way to teach then is to then point out the design moves that a design professional made to say, well, this is why you feel that way, because that transom window over there lets light come in throughout the day. And you are also looking at a large window that you're connected with your garden, which brings you joy on a continual basis. Those things together creates a space that, and creates calm and serenity and peace, or whatever the emotion you just talked about. So it's making that connection between design and feeling, kind of.
Right. Yeah. The example I have here is one more of interpersonal relationships, but like when I fell in love with my wife, I didn't know exactly why there was this attraction. It just was. But as I learned more about psychology, as I learned more about my own shortcomings and weaknesses and things lacking in my life that she brought that made me feel more alive, I started to then be able to understand why I had this feeling towards this person and why they added that to my life. And in the same way, what you're saying, I love this space. Well, okay, that's good. We can just replicate that for you. Or, you have very unique problems. We're going to have to manipulate this space in some way. let's get more specific about, well, why do you like this space? Well, it feels bright. All right. Windows, and properly placed windows, and paint colors, and materials. And yeah, I always wondered in architecture school why there wasn't a more scientific approach to architecture. Because I remember seeing in, I think it was graphic illustration, whatever, a space having a ceiling that came down like that would make you feel like you wanted to go to the edges, or a space with a dome would make you feel like you more want to come to the center. It was always interesting to me that it didn't seem like this process of architecture was a scientific endeavor. And to me, a scientific endeavor is based foundationally in objectified consistencies that you project towards an unknown, where art or architecture are looking at objectified problems that need to be solved into a solution. And it's somehow the difference between an artistic process and a scientific process.
And unlike, I think, the scientific process, perhaps those emotions of space, I'll call them those emotions that you feel whether you're in your space, whether it's a dome or whether it's a concave thing, also are influenced by the psychology of what you've done as a kid or grown up as. There's some things that influence how you lived as a child that might influence how you're going to feel a space in the future. And so some of that is getting to that. One of the first questions we ask is, did you love the home you grew up in, and then why? Kind of get into some of the points about what that was. Was it a Frank Lloyd Wright house with very low ceilings and a high space to kind of bring joy at certain points, or was it a colonial that was very ordered and regular, and you felt comfortable about knowing your place in that space?
Right.
And so there's a lot of that kind of goes into it as well.
Now, why do you think there's such importance? This is a very deep and general question again. Why do you think there's such importance on the time that we spent as children informing our relationship to our reality?
Well, you're getting me into the psychology of growing up and emotions and things like that. So I don't necessarily have the answer why the psychology side of things affects us that way. I just know that it does. And I know that we've had, deeper conversations with clients in the past, and we've gotten to the root cause of it being that something that they just didn't like it because when they were a kid, they had a negative response to it. Whether that was, I don't know, getting very personal, or just kind of just the fact that, they hated the brick in the house because it was cold and wet and my room was always damp and you better not put brick in my house.
Right.
Just to kind of real things like that.
Yeah.
So the psychology of it, I'm not going to get into that part of it. That's someone else's job to do that, but I just know there's a reaction to that.
So you being human, I'm gonna run a theory by you. So was your childhood everything you dreamed it would be?
Wow. From hindsight, I could say probably no. While I was living in the moment, I probably thought yes. There was, I actually grew up in the mountains of northern Utah, which was a very kind of wide open experience. In one sense, wide open as far as this idea of the natural environment. In another sense, not so wide open as far as the conservative views of people in the area. And so I didn't know that when I was a child. Those conservative views didn't really influence me a whole lot.
Yeah.
So I just reacted to this idea of the openness of the space. So now when I live in Connecticut right now, which to me oftentimes feels closed and condensed because all the trees, which, tend to keep my viewpoints fairly limited until I get to the coast or I get to the river or something like that where I can expand my views. I feel like I enjoy those views with a greater knowledge now because of that and the history of where I was. So That's a long answer to probably your question, but did my childhood live up to my expectations? Yes.
Where did you form those expectations?
I think I only formed them after the fact. I
Right.
didn't have expectations while I was living it. Now as I look back at it, I said, yeah, that was a pretty good way to go.
Right.
Yeah.
So the original question though, was your childhood everything you dreamed it would be? Asking, when you preconceived an expectation of your childhood, when you lived your childhood, did it live up to that preconceived expectation?
That's a really hard That's a really hard question. I don't know if I remember my dreams. I mean, I was able to do basically anything I wanted to do growing up in the 70s and 80s. So I didn't have a whole lot
Yeah,
of
so it was a much more free time. Yes.
exactly. I didn't have a whole lot of limitations, and so I'd say yes, my expectations were met. My dreams were met. I didn't always live up to my own personal goals,
Right.
which is a whole different story.
Right. But the
But I was given the
complexity,
opportunity to do that.
the complexity and riddle in that question to begin with is that you don't get to dream or preconceive your childhood. You only get to experience it.
Yep.
So then the follow-up question is, at what point in your life did you start to live against a preconceived expectation? And I'll bet you when you start to live your life against a preconceived expectation, that there's some amount of loss of magic and joy that happens. Not completely, but we know that living up to someone else's expectations is not good. We know that. And Theodore Roosevelt has a good quote. I think it was Theodore Roosevelt, that comparison is a thief of joy. So at some point in your childhood, you were completely living through only experiencing. You were only living subjectively. You were only taking in experience and feeling emotions. And then at some point, you preconceived an expectation of how your life should be. So I would be willing to bet that that magical point that is so incredibly formative as a child comes from that lack of living against your own preconceived expectations. But it's just
I
a
tend
theory.
to agree. I like. No, I mean I like the way you put it. I think it's very very true because and where that switch happens when you start to consciously understand what your expectations are. Has that happened at high school? Has that happened at college? Does that happen as soon as you get a job or whatever it might be? There's probably differences for everybody, but
Right.
yeah, I think I can see that living in the moment versus living for the future. There's two different ways to look at life.
Yeah, and I've found in recent times with my kids that that whole idea of people saying be present, and I just had no idea what that meant. But I've found that if I can put aside my expectational, analytical rationality, like if I can put aside the analytical part of my mind and just experience a moment with my children, that it's crazy amazing that there's some amount of beauty, just raw beauty to experience that that interaction with a child that's free of this really loud, or not really loud, but very persistent voice of preconceived expectations and everything else. And it working in that frame of thought is the first kind of more concrete way of thinking about being present that I've been able to come up with, that has allowed me to live with a lot more joy and experiencing my own emotions that oddly are just through this conversation. They're connected to everything.
Have you been able to make that moment, that living in the moment, kind of stick, or does it snap out every then? Because I've noticed that it snaps in and out. It's like
Yeah.
I'm living in the moment right now, but the next minute I can be completely out of it.
That is a great. I can feel it slip away. I can completely feel it slip away, and like the worry comes in, the the Instagram feed of some other photographer's work goes by me, and I'm like, oh crap, I got to get out of this moment, and I got to go conceptualize how I'm going to do work better than that, because then all these moments aren't going to be possible anymore, you know?
Yep.
But there's some deep peace that, geez, to get biblical, there's some deep peace that passes understanding, that when you become like one of these little ones, you're connected to something. And I'm not a religious person, but those are some really deep biblical truths that I'm just saying biblical because I'm pulling them from there, and they feel like they have a resonance throughout human experience if you see these things.
Well, and tying that concept back to what we're trying to do with a little bit on Your Modern Cottage is part of this concept of people's expectations are of Instagram images or watching HGTV or being in someone else's world, and those expectations are not their world. Mm. And so the idea of Your Modern Cottage is to get back to this idea of what are your real life things, right? Let's not focus and let's not try to mimic someone else's. Let's get to you, and let's get to solving you. Yeah, and then that helps, I think, alleviate some expectations.
Yeah, the idea of it's a cut both ways kind of thing, because you see an objectified beauty in one sense, and then that tells you, I like that, therefore I should desire to have it and possess it, which then, further objectifies your idea of what your life should be. But at the same time, those further objectified living rooms, exteriors, kitchens, whatever, through the process of design and photography and presentation, they inform you what you want to create in your own space through those processes of objectification, that you can relate to it and say, I like it. And if you do your job right on Your Modern Cottage through educating people on why they like something, then they can say, I like this because of that, and I see that this window is doing that, or this paint color is doing that, or those surfaces, textures, countertops are doing that. So I'll take this piece of that objectified space into this image, and I'll say I like that in what I want to create. So if there's this ability to differentiate between I just repeat that, or what is it about that I like that I can incorporate into my whole thing moving forward, I think that makes sense.
And I think the challenge of today is that the amount of information we have, that it's really hard to focus on one thing or several things. You're focusing on millions of things, and that causes frustration and distraction in people, and it causes, I think, stress when they're thinking about their homes. They're trying to make too many things happen because these objects are out there. Right. And in reality, part of this is to focus the real things to their attention and say, these are the things that are the ones that are reminiscent of who you are. Don't be distracted by that shiny brass object over there. Let's focus on what your blue comm is all about, and let's go find that.
Yeah, cool. Well, that is, for me, that's some swimming in the deep end there. I've been treading water, barely keeping my nose above the surface. So much of what we've talked about has been stuff that I've been working on, that has been an epiphany for me, really, in just the last week, seeing it all coalesce, if that's the right word, into something that I can use.
Sounds like you're turning this into a mantra of some sort, or a way to create, or something like that you're kind of getting your hands around.
Yeah, I'm not a religious personality type, but I grew up very religious and I lost that. So I had at one point in my life a very scripted way to approach reality, and lost that. So I've had to really dig deep if I'm going to have something to hold on to that I can justify. So to lose that thing, but to accept the call to justify that is a real, you start to look into things and you really start to grasp things like, I think, therefore I am, and, God is dead,
Yep.
but we killed him. This objectification of the abstract into something that you can hold is the form of a graven image. Spirituality objectified is religion. Religion objectified becomes a graven image, and you lose the ability to subject yourself and experience something. You've just received a cold, dead object rather than a relationship. So I think if you bare yourself raw, you only learn, you learn a lot about yourself and about reality if it doesn't consume you. So there's that fine line to to walk on.
Gotcha.
That's taken time. So yeah, that all just kind of came out on you from this last week. So, but to get your critical feedback is really interesting, because you've obviously thought about this process of creativity and how that fits into our reality and everything else. And that's been, I really appreciate that. So thank you.
Thank you. Well, you've done a good job putting it into words though too. That's great.
Well, that whole articulated knowledge coming from our native tongue of emotions, it's a one and then next, and then, well, what does that mean? What are we, and what is our purpose? And this whole thing of creativity is part of that. It's all interconnected. And the further we can articulate that, I think the better understanding all of us are going to have about each other. And they'll just be more homeostasis. There'll be a better balance between all of us. And so I think that's our call to contribute. It's just a further understanding of this reality. So
cool.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. That's something.
Who would have thought that's what we'll be talking about? But there we go.
Yeah, but I think it's just so great that it relates to directly what you're talking about and why you formed Modern Cottage. And if anything's true, it can relate to everything. So that it helps me, and it helps me see what you're doing as something of great value for people. So that's
Good.
Awesome. So,
Good.
Well, thanks so much for taking the time to sit down with me and listen to my ramblings and to share some of your ramblings. And thank you.
Well, I appreciate the time, and by all means, if you have any more discussions you want to have on this, give me a ring, and we'll talk more through it.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Rick Staub, if I'm pronouncing that right.
You got it.
A principal, I would imagine, at One Point Architects, is it?
Point One Architects in Old Lyme, Connecticut. Yep.
Point One Architects in Old Lyme, Connecticut, and co-founder of Your Modern Cottage.
Correct.
Awesome. Thank you so much, and maybe we'll see you again soon.
Thanks, Trent. Talk to you soon.
All right. Bye-bye.